Good evening, and my guest is an esteemed writer, a Canadian treasure, if you will, a winner of the David Gemmell Morningstar Award and two Stabbies, and thus the owner of two Sword Awards. He is also the human servant of a cat named Croft, and a dear friend of mine. Welcome, Nicholas. How are you?
Wonderful. Thanks for having me. I technically have three swords awards, three swords awards. Sorry.
What's the third one?
The other one I got from Book Nest, which is just an absolutely massive killing blade. It's not like a stabby at all. It's just like a huge anime sword
Are you
that
serious?
I keep kind of in my room because if someone broke into my house and got to it before me, I'd be dead. So
Because your stabbies are basically daggers. They're not that long.
yeah, no, this
Okay.
thing is massive, heavy, sharp as heck. Like it's wild.
Damn.
Yeah.
Damn. I didn't know. You're gonna have to send me a picture of that sometime
Oh, I
because
will.
that sounds fascinating. I'm just imagining like just a Final Fantasy or like a Monster Hunter sword that's just like hanging over the shoulder.
I mean, it looks a lot like the sword of the main character from Bleach, I believe it is.
Okay.
It's kind of copied off that one, so it
Damn.
is crazy looking.
Man. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm excited. I'm excited to see this. Well, how are you, man? How are you? How's life in Ontario?
Oh, it's pretty good, pretty good. Our lockdown, we've been actually under a lockdown for months now, unlike kind of most of the rest of Canada, which is easing up, but we've had everything closed for months now, so it opens up in about a week, or it starts to open up, so I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, that's
Get
good.
to the little bookstore again.
Oh man. Yeah. I remember there's a bookstore in Kingston that you took me to that was beautiful, beautiful. That basement just full of tabletop gaming
Yeah,
setups,
so much
comics, and everything.
amazing.
Oh man, yeah, I can imagine. I mean, what are you most looking forward to in terms of like your changing lifestyle with
Probably
the
that place there opening up.
yeah.
Just because I usually, like whenever I'm downtown, I kind of go in there and browse through stuff. But the
Mhm.
bookstore will be nice too, and then coffee shops. I mean, I haven't we haven't they haven't been actually open. Like you can't go in there and sit down for over a year now. So
Mhm.
uh, hopefully, eventually we'll be able to go back in there and people watch and write.
And that was pretty much your mainstay in terms of like writing locale, right?
Oh yeah, that and home. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, just like a nice coffee, sit down at a table, people watch a little bit,
yeah.
soak in the atmosphere.
Put some music on, drift away.
Oh
Yeah.
damn. Yeah. Well, that sounds good. I mean, I can imagine after this last year, you've been feeling pretty cooped up. And how is that sort of reflecting in your writing lifestyle and in your work lifestyle?
Well, I'm at a point now where, like, having lived in Vancouver for many years and working in restaurants, I did a lot of drinking and a lot of going out and a lot of late nights. And so I'm definitely like not totally over it, but kind of over it. And living in it's like rural Ontario, it's much better. And as far as the pandemic goes, it's like I prefer the inside anyway. If I'm outside, I'm usually just reading outside or else running outside, which is solitary. And then otherwise, I've got books and video games, and there's zero possibility of me being bored for the rest of my ever.
The true writer's lifestyle. Yeah.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
writer's mantra. I'm
yeah,
isolated and I'm happy.
yeah. I feel like once you're into video games, there's not enough time. Your one lifetime is not enough.
No, no.
It's too much out there. So, and the
Yeah.
same.
I mean, we'll talk about video games later, but it's just so easy to sink hundreds of hours into anything,
Yeah.
you know, whether it's like The Witcher 3 or something like that is
Oh, and I did. Yeah.
it's hundreds of books contained within that one game in
Yeah.
terms of hours spent. Oh man. Well, since we've known each other for well, just to give context to anyone listening, we've known each other for about 10 years now.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I guess we
Feels
started
like
work. I started working at a restaurant in Vancouver when I was a spry, naive 19-year-old, and Nicholas was
probably an over the hill 30.
no, you were one of the older employees who I actually looked up to in terms of like the way you approach things and the attitude that you had? Because there were a lot of people who were essentially what I would call lifers
Oh,
and
yeah.
alcoholics and just kind of
Very jaded and bitter and uh,
wasting away,
their,
sadly.
their
Yeah,
section and their money and yeah.
exactly. But you always had a bit of like, you always had your humor, but then you also had the mystery of being so passionate about something that it took a long time to sort of, get to know you and open that up to figure out, oh crap, this guy's writing fantasy novels. That's so cool. But there was an air of mystery about you that I always appreciated.
Perfect. And I do my
Um,
best to cultivate it.
yeah. And so since we know each other, I would like to delve a little bit more into your upbringing and how you got to where you are and the things that influenced you along your road. So let's start
Okay.
out. I mean, we are fellow Canadians. What would you say about Canada was an influence upon you, or how did it sort of affect you and your personality and the way you approach life?
Um, well, by the idea that all Canadians are nice is definitely not true whatsoever.
False, such a
There's
false.
the shit everywhere you look, but I mean we're a lot nicer than a lot of other people in the world. So, I mean we're also very privileged and very lucky. So it kind of enables us to, yeah, to have a bit more flexibility and freedom in our lives. And for me, at least, which is not true for every Canadian, but I grew up in a relatively rural setting. So I could go across the street and into a forest and get absolutely lost, or a swamp, or, I could shoot a bow and arrow in my backyard and no one was going to call the neighbors because there were no neighbors, you know? So it was pretty like, yeah, it was growing up in a semi-rural place was, I think, pretty beneficial. And a lot, when you're young and you read a lot of fantasy books and you're reading about Frodo and Sam, like
Mhm.
journeying through the woods, it's pretty easy to imagine yourself doing the same thing when you've got a Gandalf-esque walking stick and your lunch packed and you're, a mile from your house but lost.
Yeah, no, I mean, it seems like you and I had pretty similar childhoods in the sense that,
Yeah,
I grew up on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, and forests, 10 steps from your house kind of thing. And exactly that. You get a walking stick and your imagination starts spinning,
yeah,
and you start to think like, cool, I'm a wizard or I'm like a druid or something in this forest.
yeah,
Even though I have my packed lunch that my mom made for me, I'm still a druid, so shut up.
yeah.
Amazing, man. And in terms of your family and siblings and everything like that, how did that all kind of come together and influence how you are in terms of your humor or in terms of the way you um, socialize with other people?
Yeah, well, I don't. I was very fortunate to have a brother who's really close in age to me. He's about a year and a half younger, and he was willing, thankfully, to kind of play the sidekick to all my adventures as a kid. So every toy you could possibly imagine that that was out in, like, say, the 80s, my childhood. I was always like the main one, and then he would be whatever the side one was. So I was He-Man, and he was Man at Arms. I was like, uh, Bill, or what's his fucking name from Ghostbusters? Why am I drawing a blank here?
I can't remember Bill
Bill,
Murray's character,
yeah,
but
yeah. But I was him, and he was Dan Aykroyd. No matter what it was, I get to pick my Ninja Turtle first. He always kind of was like second fiddle. I was Batman, he was Robin.
oh,
Um,
poor guy, poor guy.
but it definitely helped, and it did help. Like, he's got an active imagination too, and we like
Yeah.
kind of the same things. But he definitely did have to. Yeah, play second fiddle sometimes for that. But it was. I mean, we had a lot of fun. Those aforementioned, forays into the woods, he would always be there as well. And um, parent-wise, I mean, I just have two very, very incredibly supportive parents that even when I was half the world away in Vancouver and working in restaurants and writing that novel for 15 years or so, they were never like, "Oh, you should get a real job." They were always, "You can do it. You can do it." So I
Follow your
think,
dreams, Nicholas. Follow your dreams.
yeah, they should have told me to get a real job probably, but they didn't. So
I mean, in hindsight, it's like they played the right cards.
In hindsight, yeah, but yeah, it could have gone wrong.
It's like, God damn it, why didn't I tell him to become a doctor or a lawyer or
Yeah,
whatever?
yeah,
No, but that's, I mean, that's, as a writer, that's essentially what you hope for, is to have parents who are supportive of that. Because
yeah,
ultimately, when it comes down to it, it's like that family support network is so important. And so many of the writers that I've met, basically all my friends, even the ones who are doing the things that they love and maybe not finding immense success in it just yet, but are sort of moving towards something better, it tends to come from a place of love and support on the part of the family. And them just saying, like, you got a dream, go for it, you know?
yeah. And the same goes for all the people I call my friends and the people I worked with in restaurants. Like once they find out you're writing a novel, they'll be like, "Hey, how's it coming? How's it coming? How's it coming?" And some people offer to read it, and so
Yeah.
definitely owe them a lot of support too, because or like a lot of thanks because they, would kind of goad me along and make me feel guilty about not.
I mean, they're essentially anti-procrastination tools
Yeah,
when it comes down to it, because, like
yeah,
you say, you feel a little bit of guilt or shame, not necessarily because you're obviously you're writing in sort of a bubble where that exists in your own space, however you manage it. But then you come to a place where people know you, and they come looking at you, and they're obviously excited for you, and they say,
yeah,
"Hey, how's it coming along?
yeah.
How's it going?" You know,
Yeah.
you want to say, "Oh, it's
One
like,"
or something like that. So yeah, yeah,
and especially from what I remember of the restaurant industry, and the Sandbar, the restaurant where we met, is different from Fable, which is the restaurant that you use the name for the band in, um, was it in Bloody Rose they used?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I don't know what the environment was like in Fable, but the Sandbar was an incredibly, um, I wouldn't say competitive necessarily, but a mix of like energetic and chaotic. It was just chaotic energy all over the place,
It was comedic.
and so many people doing so many things that it was easy to get lost, but it was also very easy to get caught up in pressure.
Yeah.
But how do you find that situations like that and all of the experiences that you've had in your lifetime have sort of prepared you for what it means to sort of be self-employed, to be self-directed in terms of your craft?
Well, it definitely. I mean, writing or sorry, working in restaurants is the perfect job for anyone that's going to try to write a book because it allows you so much flexibility and free time. You can't always choose your schedule, but you can. It kind of can. If you
Mm-hmm.
work certain days or what job you do there, um, and you meet people in that industry that like like we said, there's a few lifers in there, but a lot of people are, especially in Vancouver, have another passion
Mm-hmm.
besides that. So when you get off work, you go out with those people and they, talk about their passions and you talk about yours. And I think it's kind of a really inspiring thing because you meet a lot of not some. I didn't meet too many writers. A lot more screenplay writers and
Actors for
never
sure.
go a stone without hitting an actor.
So many actors.
Yeah, many and so yeah, I think it's very lends itself so well to having another creative pursuit on the side, and especially writing a series of books like obviously they're based on like the rock and roll life, but people in them do a lot of socializing, a lot of laughing, a lot of camaraderie, and that's such a huge part of restaurant life.
Mhm.
A lot of drinking and partying and
A lot of incestuous
oh,
circumstances.
people in the band, you know, and so I think it lends itself really well. There's some, sometimes I read a book written by someone who I know does not party and has never partied really, or like maybe not for a long time, and you can tell they don't know how to write it.
It just
They
falls flat.
just falls flat. They don't know what the bar atmosphere feels like when you're inside, or
Yeah.
things like that. And so I like to think that a decade or so of decadence debauchery
Paid
helped.
off. It paid off.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I never thought about it actually. How the band aspect, like a group of mercenaries or a rock and roll band, translates so perfectly to a restaurant scenario. I recently read or reread Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential,
Yeah.
which is a phenomenal book. It is so good, and especially for someone who's worked in a restaurant.
Yeah.
Regardless, if you've never worked in a restaurant and want to understand the sheer insanity, debauchery, disgusting crap that goes on within a restaurant,
Yeah.
it's the perfect book to read. But it reminded me of that, where it's kind of like this camaraderie is so impactful on various aspects of your life, and it almost comes down to this sort of honor-based, blood brother-esque
Yeah.
system where you do things for the people that you love, and you unconsciously undermine the people that work at the restaurant that you don't care about.
Yeah.
And it comes down to this really messed up interplay of relationships, of likes and dislikes and personality clashes.
Yeah.
And a lot of that plays into rock and roll as well.
Yeah. It's on a less intense scale, obviously,
Yeah.
but when you're, especially at a place like the fucking Sandbar, it was just bonkers there some night. You lose your mind. And, and the same thing for, if you're on stage, it's like, you get kind of lost in it, or you're tired, or you're exhausted, and
Or you're high or something.
you go to the Sandbar and you need fucking sushi. So you need to go down 2 floors, and you come up and there's no soy sauce. So you got to go back down. There's no soy sauce. Back down again. You're exhausted. You think your rock stars are tired. And you snap at your coworkers sometimes, you're angry at them throughout the shift, the bartender's taking too long, all this kind of stuff. And then at the end of the night, when you're all sitting there counting your money and with your beer in front of you, you're all friends.
Nothing matters. Exactly. It's like all the crap that happens. It kind of reminds me of how so many bands, they break up in the most destructive ways.
Yeah.
But then they kind of come back together for a reunion tour in the 2000s or the 2010s.
Yeah.
And they've matured
Yeah.
and they've understood, all the crap that happened in our lives, it's all under the rug, Yeah. At the end of the day, it's about family, and it's about this camaraderie between the people that decided to pursue something together, whether it's creative or it's a restaurant where you're serving food to people.
You feel great if you pulled it off. You're like, we did good tonight. We all survived. We got through it. We'll do it again tomorrow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you've spoken to Wayne Lee recently, but every time I talk to that guy over the years, how you doing, man? Living, surviving.
Yeah. Well, I mean, almost most of my best friends, and almost all of them from Vancouver, are restaurant people.
Yeah. But they all have that mentality of kind of like living, surviving, and there seems to be a certain amount of sort of pride through adversity that comes with that.
Speaking of, I actually owe you a huge debt of gratitude from one night when we were out drinking, and I tell this to people all the time, that you were the person that got me to stop wearing cargo shorts.
Really?
I'm grateful, but I wasn't there yet. I have always kind of thought myself, relatively fashionable, and I wasn't there yet. I didn't get it. And one day, I forget, I was ribbing on you about something, maybe a flat-rimmed hat or something stupid.
Or skinny jeans or something like that, yeah.
Which I wear now, but something. And you were like, well, this is from the guy in cargo shorts. And I kind of like brushed it off, and then I was like, well, fuck, man, maybe he's onto something. And I started looking around and doing research. I was like, well, fucking cargo shorts are weird. And so I stopped wearing them, and a few girlfriends since have all been grateful to you and your.
Well, you're welcome, and you're welcome even more to all of your girlfriends since that time.
Changed my life.
Thinking back on it, I'm like, okay, if he was wearing cargo shorts so adamantly, it's like you have the perfect vehicle to shove a little paperback book into your shorts.
Well, I don't think I used the pockets or anything.
No?
no.
So
I
then
just
you're wearing cargo shorts without any purpose.
yeah, pretty
Oh
much.
man. Okay. Well, I'm glad I got you off of that train.
Yeah, it went really great with my rugby shirt from American Eagle.
Oh my God. Uh, I honestly did not remember that, so
Yeah,
I'm very happy that you stopped wearing
me too.
them. Yeah, it's just like a little alcohol fueled, off the cuff comment
Yeah,
that digs deeper than
the
intended.
course of a person's life. Yeah,
Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff that changes you, you know.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe someone's
Speaking
watching this right now and they look down and think, "I'm wearing cargo shorts."
like my
No,
dad is all about cargo shorts.
never too late to change, and you may be, take offense and like, how dare they? But just let it sink in. Tomorrow, throw them in a garbage bag.
Burn them in a dumpster.
Yeah,
I'll tell my dad that he's still a champion of cargo, not cargo shorts necessarily, but cargo pants, but the ones that zip at the knee.
yeah,
He's just like a multi-purpose man.
yeah.
But he's 66, so I don't really blame him at this point.
Yeah, no. And
Um,
the other day on Instagram, I got advertised some sort of like super fashionable brand new cargo pant that's coming back. They're coming back apparently. So maybe don't throw your cargo pants out yet.
fuck.
You're on
Oh
the
my
corner.
god, man. It's like I've been to the jungle here in Ecuador and I still have not worn cargo pants. It's like if there was any situation where cargo pants would be useful, it would be the Amazon jungle.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
alas, no. Alas, no. Yeah. Well, speaking of influences and small moments that can change your life, what was it that got you started with science fiction and fantasy, and what were some of the pivotal books that sent you off on a path to where you are now?
Well, the most pivotal one is pretty traditional, the Lord of the Rings, only because it was the first trilogy I ever read. And I think kind of like when you're young or if you were my age, if you watch a Star Wars movie around that time, like getting to see characters from one movie their lives continue in a second movie was magical. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
makes movies like Star Wars so good, and franchises in general. And with books, I mean, obviously it happens in literature sometimes, like say a Jack Ryan book or something, but fantasy is like what invented that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you like this story, wait till you see what happens next. New book.
Hence, epic fantasy.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll always remember, like I remember the room, I remember everything about finishing the two towers and the last line being Frodo was alive but taken by the enemy. And I was like, what? And just like threw the book, grabbed the next one and started reading. And it's like, oh, it's going to be half the book of the battle at Minas Tirith. But
Yeah.
that definitely like impacted me and made me kind of love fantasy. I didn't get into video games until actually like my teens, so they weren't like that formative as far as that goes. But I think it was just like probably Lord of the Rings, and then major books that had an impact. Like when I first read Guy Gavriel Kay, who I usually mention about 80 billion times in every
You
interview.
got me on Guy Gavriel K. You got me
Yeah,
on the GGK train.
yeah. I mean, and the first time I read Guy Gavriel Kay, it was in high school, and I had a book report due the next day that had to be a Canadian author.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I went to the library and I was just like, anything will do. I looked for a Canadian spine. There's one. I picked it out. It was book 3 of a trilogy. And I was like, fuck it. I forgot time for the first 2. Started reading it. And it was about people named like Paul and Kim and Dave taken to a fantasy world. I'm like, this is ridiculous and so
Yeah.
stupid. Kept reading, and there's like King Arthur's in it. And I'm like, oh, this is fucking terrible. And then a day later, and I was bawling my fucking eyes out. And I'd never read a book in my life, and I was bawling. So it seriously, seriously affected me. And then a few years, like I read a couple different Guy Gavriel Kay standalones over the next few years, and eventually went back and read that whole trilogy. And when I got to that third book, I remember on the bus to North Vancouver sobbing so hard I had to close the book and get off, and I sat on the curb at the gas station and finished it.
Wow.
Just racking
What?
sobs.
Which trilogy was that?
That's the Fiona of our Tapestry.
Mm-hmm.
So the third book of that is a doozy. You read that one?
No, I've read Tigana and the Lions of Al Rassan,
Yeah.
which I think are probably as far as you've recommended to me, like the best entry points into Guy Gavriel Kay's work.
Yeah, they're pretty good. Song for Arben's a good one too. Under Heaven I really like, but those ones are the best for sure.
Yeah.
And then there's one more of his books, got a duology called the Serenity Mosaic, about an artist, a mosaic artist who gets called to go from like quote unquote Rome to Constantinople. And that book is all about like leaving a legacy, whether you're a chef, whether you're a chariot racer, whether you're an emperor, whether you're an artist. And it not only was that the theme of that book so formative, but the actual writing itself, like, it is peak Guy Gavriel Kay, absolute peak. And it was a very specific page of that book that it was so extremely well written that I was like, this is what I would like to do with the rest of my life. So,
just the poeticism that which he has a very, it's not like Patrick Rothfuss, which is more towards, I would say, lyricism in a way. He almost writes in a way that is like a song, but Guy Gavriel Kay is like, his work is just poetry. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's quite like him. I've read a couple people that write that, they'll evoke similar feelings to him, but nobody writes just like him. Like, yeah.
And it's a bit of a shame. I mean, I wanted to sort of shift in towards nerd culture, but I guess this is a good jumping off point. But Guy Gavriel Kay is one of those authors who I think, in terms of the fantasy genre, is so under recognized for the quality of his work. The sheer quality of his work is so good, but you don't really hear too much about him in different circles. You were the first person that ever mentioned him to me, and since then, I've seen little trickles sort of spread out in different ways, but it's usually centered around one of those entry points, such as Tigana. But this just kind of gets into a thing about nerd culture and fantasy and science fiction culture, which is there are far too many authors who are incredibly talented, but don't receive the recognition that they deserve.
Yeah.
So I don't know. What do you think about that general aspect of nerd culture and the ways in which, I guess some stuff just gets lost to time, but Guy Gavriel Kay is still alive and he's still producing amazing work. So it's kind of this mystery to me.
Well, Guy Gavriel Kay, I mean, he's doing all right. Don't cry for him.
I will cry for him.
Because I mean, he comes up whenever, like, if you're on Reddit and someone's looking for lyrical prose, like the most beautiful writing, he's going to be in there. He's usually going to be number one. A lot of people will bring up Robin Hobb, and Robin Hobb is, don't get me wrong, an excellent author, but she writes differently than Guy Gavriel Kay. Like, it's not the same. And so he's always going to come up there. I mean, I remember I saw like Brandon Sanderson does those lectures on YouTube. Or at least they're on YouTube.
Yeah.
And at one point, this is like when I like will respect Brandon Sanderson forever for this, but he goes, and this was a few years ago, but he was like, in my opinion, there's only two like pure geniuses writing fantasy today. And on the board behind him, he wrote Terry Pratchett, understandable, and Guy Gavriel.
Damn.
And I was like, okay, this guy knows his stuff. And so, I mean, yeah. Yes, Guy Gavriel Kay should be read a bit more, but at the same time, it's very dense stuff. Not crazy, but pretty dense. And so obviously, it's way easier to read a Brandon Sanderson book. Who Brandon Sanderson he said he actively goes through, and if he writes a line that's too beautiful, he'll not dumb it down, but like tone it down so it doesn't break the reader out of a book.
True.
Whereas a line that breaks me out of the book and makes me just go, "What the fuck did I just read?" Just crazy.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, that's a very interesting point. I guess Guy Gavriel Kay, the way that he writes is not really mass market in that sense. Like Brandon Sanderson is like the type of fantasy that is written to be consumed en masse.
Yeah.
And he knows it, and he does that very, very well.
Yeah.
Whereas Guy Gavriel Kay, his writing is representative of the characters that he writes, to be honest. he writes about artists and people that don't really fit into the typical mold of the hero, the hero's journey, things that have been staples of the fantasy genre for such a long time.
No, exactly. Like the book Under Heaven, it opens like the story is that a guy inherits, I think it's just like 100 horses, and that's it. That's the story. But the horses are so valuable because of what they can breed, how amazing they are, and they're introduced uh, to like a Tang Dynasty China kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, that's who would come up with that and be like, okay, my story is about a guy who inherits a bunch of horses and his journey back to the capital and what
Mm-hmm.
happened. Like, it's not enough. For most people, it's not enough. There's no sleep.
Exactly. Exactly. It's kind of playing into this idea of what um, in any given story, where does conflict arise, right?
Yeah,
And where does conflict arise from a guy who gets a bunch of horses, you
yeah,
know, or a mosaicist
yeah,
or something along those lines.
yeah.
Um,
But I mean,
it's
also back to your earlier point about like there being so many other writers out there that don't get the recognition. Like GGK, especially him, is doing great compared to like there's so many. Like before I became an author, I had no clue. I looked at a bookshelf in a bookstore and thought these are all authors. That's
mhm,
what I do for a living. Um, having no idea. And I think I had someone who told me before that only like 5% of authors or less actually like write for a living. And I
mhm.
think I just dismissed it. I just thought that cannot be true. And it so is, like so is, and 5%'s pushing it.
Yeah, yeah,
Now because I know these people, I can go to the bookstore and like, okay, this person, is an accountant. This person works at a restaurant. This person literally works in a produce section. This person does this. Like,
mhm,
so many of them have different jobs. And I remember right before, about 5 or 6 months before my book came out, there's this author named Michael Fletcher who wrote a book called, the series is called Manifest Delusions. What was this book called? It's got a Richard Anderson cover and everything. But whatever, I read it. I loved it. It was phenomenal. And I was like, where's the next one? And I looked up and it's like not coming out. The publisher wouldn't buy it
damn,
because it only sold within like months and months and months of coming out, something like 700 copies.
mm,
And that number was crazy to me. I was like, what do you mean 700 copies? This is in bookstores. Like,
yeah,
all you hear when you're younger or an aspiring writer is you look at those Stephen Kings, those Brandon Sandersons, those, J.K. Rowlings, and not realize that someone sells 15,000 copies of a book, they are laughing, and they can write. And as long as they keep selling 50,000 copies of every book they write, they're good to go. But that
exactly.
rarely happens. And thankfully, that Michael Fletcher guy ended up capitalizing on how many people really love that book and starting a self-published career.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the saving grace at this point is sort of publishers are starting to show limitations to a certain degree.
Mm.
You know, that's unfortunately the double-edged sword of the publishing industry is okay, you want to go into traditional publishing. Obviously, you have to put in a ton of work up front in terms of writing the book, querying to an agent, getting that agent, the agent then having to query a publisher, et cetera, et cetera. It's such a long process.
Yeah.
But at the end of it, you don't really know how well that book is going to sell because it is in the hands of somebody else, right? And so when you have self-publishing, it's so cool that Michael Fletcher was able to do this sort of pivot and take what was in the traditional publishing industry considered a failure and put it into the self-publishing industry and capitalize on the people who loved his book,
Yeah.
push it, market it to the right people, and find some sort of success in it.
Yeah. Beyond Redemption is the name of that book. Yeah.
Yeah.
People in it have like superpowers almost based on like whatever their psychosis is. Like, it's good. It's good.
Okay, I'm gonna check it out.
Evil. Real fucking evil.
It was right up your alley. Perfect.
Yeah.
Well,
But
we'll
it's,
speak.
especially during the pandemic, there were like so many authors that came out this year.
Mhm.
And, you know, there are stats that show that people read a lot more last year, but I think what they read was the authors they already knew, because so many debut authors just like fell into this abyss and
Hmm.
have to struggle to get out of it, or hopefully, or find a way to get themselves noticed. And there's authors out there that have like agents that I dreamed about getting, publishers that I dreamed about having, cover artists that I would adore to have, and their book just like,
Thanks.
yeah, best editors in the world. Yeah, you just
Yeah.
never know.
But that's the fickle nature of the market is no matter how much a publisher puts behind something, they could put a ton of marketing dollars behind it, but in the end, everything's unpredictable, and especially right now when the market is so divided between audiobooks, and that's taking up a gargantuan portion of the market as well,
Yeah,
versus ebooks versus physical books, and how all of this is sort of working in conjunction, but at the same time counteracting each other in a lot of ways.
yeah,
So it's just an unpredictable game, unfortunately.
yeah. And publishers, I mean, their hands are tied too. I mean, there's lots of people that think they could be doing things differently, and I'm sure they could, but at the same time, they're looking at probably shrinking revenues, and they don't know. I mean, often if they promote the shit of a book, it's going to do well if you put like a lot of money behind it. But they probably don't have a lot of money to put behind every single book. So
Exactly. I mean, well, in terms of your personal experience with first, because you have an interesting case just as an author who's published 2 books.
mhm.
With Kings of the Wilds, you were an unpublished author, and that came out, and you were introduced to a whole brand new market, and then Bloody Rose was sort of your reintroduction to something that you'd already begun to understand the inner workings of. So what was it like going from that first experience of pre-published and then Kings of the Wild coming out, and then how did that compare to Bloody Rose?
Well, that's a great question.
Thank
Um,
you.
it was kind of different. I mean, Kings of the Wild was, I think, a lot of people. It was a shock to a lot of people how well it did. Um, to me, like, I wouldn't have been shocked a year before, because I'm like, this is the best fucking book I ever written. And then 6 months before, when I found out that books could sell fucking 700 copies, I was like shook. And I was like, well, maybe things aren't going to work out. And then, I was like, what books are coming out that same week is it? And things like that. And at first I would look at its Goodreads ratings and things like their reads and see how many people were reading it and rating it and stuff like that. And I was, extremely fortunate that Kings of the Wild kind of took off, and it did really well. And it ended up like earning out my advance within 10 months or something like that.
Mhm.
And with Bloody Rose, I think because it had an audience, and there was a lot more like buzz around Bloody Rose coming out. And then Orbit, they bent over backwards to make some really cool production, or some promotion materials for that. I have like a T-shirt. Yeah, there you go, the
Dude,
bookmark.
this thing is just like all bent out of shape, but I love it so much.
Yeah, and it should be, yeah. So I have a T-shirt with those written on the back, like it was like a band, like a tour shirt.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, they have the audiobook codes for the audiobook were sent out in little cassette tapes. And to be fair, it's an easy book to market, I think, that way.
Yeah.
Once you approach the rock and roll aspect of it, there's a lot of fun, gimmicky stuff you can do with it. So I think with the first one, obviously, no one's got the money, or they don't have the money to you don't know how a book's going to sink or swim, so you can't throw a lot of money at marketing a new book. And especially Kings of the Wild it was a different book than everything was coming out at the time.
Hmm.
At the very end of like the Grimdark era. And so I think once it took off, it's a bit more of not a sure thing by any means, but the money that they invest in it now will hopefully pay off in word of
Hmm.
mouth.
And you've seen, funny enough, the market sort of adopting more of what I would call comedic fantasy.
Totally.
Yours is not 100% comedic, but there are so many comedic elements just from your personality being infused into the writing. But you've
Yeah.
seen so much more comedic fantasy that has been pushed out in the last 3 years or so.
Yeah. I mean, it seems absurd to me to take credit for that, right? Like it's ridiculous. Like, even like if a author that I've loved for many years like even mentions me on Twitter, I'm like, oh my God. So imagining yourself responsible for some sort of industry trend seems like a pretty like some hubris to me, but at the same time, it is kind of undeniable because there are books that have come out that you can tell that they're engineered to be sort of like Kings of the Wild, you
Yeah.
know. And whether it's the editors looking for them or whether it's authors being like, oh, I can write that, I want to write that too. Like, I didn't realize we were allowed to write funny books.
Yeah. I mean, that's the strange thing about fiction in general, not just fiction, but writing and music and everything, is there's just a little spark and that triggers something in a certain subset of people who have the desire to do some project, creative work, and they suddenly realize, oh shit, this is marketable. This is something that I can write and I want to write, and it's evoking me as a creative individual. But people also want to read it.
Yeah.
It's not like going back however many decades. Terry Pratchett just absolutely nailed comedic fantasy.
Truly, yeah.
It was a difficult thing to compare anyone to him and say, however many books he released over the course of his career, he could have sparked someone to be like, oh, I can do comedic fantasy, and Terry Pratchett sells well, so can I.
Yeah.
It's a bit tricky in that sense. So,
Yeah.
so I don't necessarily think it's hubris, but it is noticeable that since Kings of the Wild, and especially since Bloody Rose came out, that a lot more comedy has been infused into the genre for the better.
And at the same time, it's just a matter of like, I feel very fortunate that I managed to like, there could have been a Kings of the Wild a year, 2 years, 3 years before me that came out and just hit this wall of like people wanting what was already successful.
Mm-hmm.
And I did kind of hit those walls of agents and editors that were like, okay, we like this, but we want like Moog taken out. We want the humor kind of toned down. We want the title changed. We want the music references gone.
We want you to be Joe Abercrombie.
Yeah, exactly. They want Joe Abercrombie like light for me, you know.
Yeah.
I can't do what Joe Abercrombie does, so I would be a pale imitation of it. And so I was very fortunate, like, and at the times, like that I got my agent who was willing to take me on. There was other agents who were willing to take me on if I changed it. And the time I got my publisher, there was other publishers that were willing to take me on if I changed it. And so if they hadn't come along, like if the publisher that wanted me to change it came along first, I might have, because I'd wanted to be a writer for 20 years and, you know, this was my shot. But I'm very fortunate that I found people that like were willing to take a chance on it and let that slip through the Grimdark. And
yeah, well, two things. First, do you think that your writing and sort of the comedic trend in fantasy is a response to Grimdark, just in terms of like the overwhelming darkness of that genre with stuff like Game of Thrones, and then the rush of really talented people like Joe Abercrombie, and then two, we'll get to this afterwards, but just what you said about the publishers and the agents and the editors who are not 100% 100% on board with the ideas and the story that you presented, such that they thought, oh, this could work better if you changed XYZ.
yeah.
So we'll go to the Grimdark one first, and then we'll jump back to the after one.
Well, I think it's a mix. Like, there's the Grimdark aspect of it, because everything was like, everyone fucking, like, if you got to the end of the book and no one died, it was insanity. Like, every book, everyone was dying left, right, and center.
Thanks, George.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I think it was that people were like, you know, there is so few funny fantasies out there. Like, you know, you look at, there was just Terry Pratchett beforehand, and I think maybe Piers Anthony, and I mean, honestly, Joe Abercrombie actually has a lot of humor in his books, and Scott Lynch has a lot of humor in his books. They were the two people that made me think, okay, maybe there's room for something that's like a little bit more like trying to be funny. But also, it was the fact that books like Game of Thrones, although it's fantasy and it's got dragons, it's also so centered around people and politics and intrigue that books, I think, for 10 years or so at least, became centered around those same things. And I was the kind of stuff I like to read was that. If you had told me, oh, here's a book, it's got goblins in it, I'd been like, fuck you. I'm not 15 years old. I'm not reading a book with goblins in it. I'm not reading a book with orcs in it or owl bears or anything. Giants. Get this out of my face. I'm
The
30.
the Dungeons and Dragons
Yeah, I'm
menagerie.
not going to read this.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what, and I've been writing a book that was just human beings and just people and no fantasy creatures. God forbid it's too fantasy. And then finally, it was getting rejected over and over again. I was like, F it, I'm going to write a book that's like got everything in there, absolutely everything. And so it was the exact opposite of everything I'd been reading, everything I loved, everything I had been writing. And it was kind of like a throwback to like earlier days and being kind of like proud of the nerd aspect of fantasy. And so I think that you're seeing a lot more of that now. There's so many books that have like, goblins in them, and they may still have like grown-up themes and things like that, but they're just a bit more willing to embrace, the fantasy in fantasy as opposed to the reality.
Yeah, and I think that's also, I mean, that's spot on, but it's also kind of like a reflection of how since, I guess in the 80s, the 70s and 80s, there was such a campiness about fantasy, but a beautiful campiness. And then into the 90s, it kind of took a downturn, and people were starting to realize, how can we change this? How can we make it more serious, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But now that campiness is being adopted in a new way, so that it's not campy anymore. It's more coming from a place of pride, like you say.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can take what was great about like the 90s and the 2000s fantasy, those realistic gritty characters, and meld them with what came before, which was like the crazy adventure, that kind of stuff, and just make something
all the creatures and all the weirdness. I think that the weirdness is what was so just steeping through all of fantasy throughout the 70s and 80s. If you look at all the covers, regardless, like all the covers are just wild bonkers.
Yeah.
Bright colors, horribly dressed, like shirtless men, women who are treated like objects, unfortunately. Just like tits hanging out of a bronze brassiere or something along those lines. Yeah. But at the heart of it, it was just about the weirdness and the imagination of it. Yeah. And that's kind of the stuff that I grew up on in the 90s, was the stuff that came out in the 80s or before. Like, I don't know if you ever read Brian Jacques' Redwall series.
No, I love the idea of them though. But
yeah, so that was like full on just beautiful camp, but applied to rodents and other woodland creatures in the best possible way. And now I think back on it, and it's just this, I don't know, just this pride that kind of seeped through, where it's like, okay, yes, they're animals, and that's obviously ridiculous to any adult in the room. Yeah. But when it comes down to it, it's good storytelling, and it's campiness and creativity and weirdness reflective of human nature, and that's kind of the best thing about it.
Yeah, I mean, these days I would read anything as long as it was good. I would read absolutely anything. Doesn't matter what's in it. And yeah, you're right. The more inventive, the better. And then moving on to your second part of the thing was like, is it about editors and things like that looking for the old stuff?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that they've evolved a lot since then. I mean, I know it's only been a couple of years, but there's been other huge breakthrough novels, especially ones written by authors that aren't white guys, that make people realize that there's people out there that are so hungry for stories that are new. And so you've got people like Rebecca Kwong writing The Poppy War, Evan Winter writing Age of Dragons, and then so many other books. I'm reading Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse right now. So
excellent book. Yeah.
Like so many other besides like the comedic fantasy movement, there's so many other movements going on. And I think editors these days are really looking for new stuff. Whatever it
Yeah.
is, I don't know what changed the industry so much, but they really are. Like, there's some wild stuff getting published nowadays. And
Yeah.
I hope it pays off for them, and I hope it pays off for the authors as well. But now more than ever, you never know what you're going to see on that bookshelf. It looks a lot different than it did in like
Hmm.
2005.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a hunger for different backgrounds and different cultures being translated or reworked or incorporated into all kinds of different stories. I mean, Black Sun, for instance, that takes indigenous American cultures, mixes it with pre-Columbian cultures like the Aztec, and then just spits it out in this beautiful mosaic of brutality, but also incorporating, you know, personal stories of gender, you know, for instance, which comes across in a realistic way. And I think a lot of people right now are looking for stories that it's like, at the very least, there's a character that is a bit more representative of me
Yeah.
as a person.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a good thing that publishers and editors are at least not that far behind in terms of understanding what the market wants, what the
Yeah.
people, what the readers want.
Some, not some, it's not all by any means, but some readers still need to not so much catch up, but there's definitely readers out there that don't like it. But, and they're obviously, they're going to be more vocal than the people that do.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you just like, I really do think it'll make a difference. I think people growing up nowadays, you know, will be able to read books and find themselves as the main character. Way more likely than just, you know, in the late 90s where everybody was Randolph Thor. And if you weren't, you know,
White farm boy.
you were a tall white farm boy with red hair, then
Yeah.
who the fuck were you?